When you think of early Christians living under Roman rule, you probably have a pretty clear image in your head, right? Systematic persecution, 10 evil emperors, 10 brutal, organized campaigns to just completely wipe out the faith. It's a really powerful story. But what if I told you it's more myth than it is history? In this explainer, we're going to investigate if one of history's most famous narratives is actually true.
All right, let's just jump right in. The 10 persecutions. Is this a historical fact, or is it a carefully constructed myth? We're going to dig into the evidence from our source material and find out what's really going on. So first, let's get on the same page about what we're actually talking about. The traditional story is super specific. 10 emperors launched 10 separate, organized campaigns with the goal of destroying Christianity. It's a very simple, very powerful story of good versus evil, and it's been told for centuries. And here they are, the supposed villains of the story, the most wanted list, if you will. You've got the infamous Nero all the way to the reformer Diocletian. This is the official lineup of emperors who, according to the story, made it their life's mission to crush the early church. And this is the exact list we're putting under the microscope today. And here's the bombshell from our source. The core argument is that this entire narrative is, in fact, a fable. That's a huge claim, right? So where in the world does an argument like that come from? Well, it all starts with understanding what the actual legal status of Christianity was in the Roman Empire. You see, this legal stuff is absolutely key. For a while, Christians had this kind of accidental protection. Rome just saw them as another weird sect of Judaism, which was a totally legal, protected religion. The trouble really started when the Romans realized, wait a minute, this is a brand new religion, which made it illegal. But even then, this status wasn't set in stone. It changed pretty dramatically over the years. And this quote, it just perfectly captures that early Roman attitude. When the Apostle Paul got dragged in front of the Roman governor Gallio, the case was just thrown out. Gallio basically said, look, this is your internal religious drama. It's not a crime against Rome, so it's not my problem. For a long, long time, that was the official stance. They just didn't care. Okay, so with that context in mind, let's go back to that traditional list of persecutors and see how the actual historical record stacks up against the legend. This is where we separate fact from fiction. First up, Domitian. The story says he persecuted the church. The reality? Domitian was a paranoid tyrant who persecuted pretty much everybody. Yes, Christians suffered under him, but so did senators, knights, his own family, basically anyone he saw as a threat. So this wasn't really a targeted religious persecution. It was just a universal reign of terror. Next up is Trajan. Now, his case is fascinating. When a governor literally wrote him and asked, hey, what am I supposed to do about these Christians? Trajan's response was surprisingly chill. He said, don't go hunting for them, and if you get an anonymous tip, ignore it. Now, if they were properly convicted, they could be punished, but that doesn't sound like a fanatical persecutor, does it? It sounds like a manager just trying to keep things orderly. And here's where the whole narrative gets really, really weird. Take Commodus, one of Rome's most monstrous and cruel emperors. Turns out he was actually friendly to Christians, mostly because his favorite concubine was sympathetic to them. And then you have Gallienus. This is a guy who ordered the slaughter of his political rivals, but he's also the emperor who issued an edict that effectively legalized Christianity. It just doesn't fit the story. Septimius Severus is another one of these complicated cases. Yes, he issued an edict, but it didn't target Christians who already existed. It only banned new conversions. If you want to know what he really spent his time on, just consider this. He had 41 senators and their entire families executed. His real target wasn't a religion. It was any threat to his power. Then you've got Aurelian. He's on the list as the 9th persecutor. And this is maybe the wildest one of all. He never actually persecuted the church. At all. There was a rumor he was planning to issue an anti-Christian decree, but he was assassinated before it ever happened. I mean, think about that. He's on the list for something he might have been thinking about doing, not for anything he actually did. So, after looking at all this evidence, how many of those 10 emperors on the traditional list can we really call true active persecutors of the church as a matter of official policy? Well, according to this analysis, the number is 5, just half. So this is the revised list. Nero, Marcus Aurelius, Decius, Valerian, and Diocletian. These are the 5 emperors whose actions represent what we can call genuine state-sanctioned persecution, something separate from just general cruelty or enforcing existing laws.
Now, let's be crystal clear. This doesn't mean the suffering wasn't real. It was absolutely horrific. The Roman historian Tacitus gives us this completely chilling account of Nero's persecution, where he used Christians as scapegoats for the Great Fire of Rome. But, and this is a critical point, this was localized to the city of Rome and was tied to that one specific event.
And this is probably the most stunning fact of them all. The very first time the Roman state even attempted a systematic, empire-wide persecution, one that required every single citizen to sacrifice to the Roman gods, that didn't happen until Emperor Decius in the year 250. That's almost 200 years after Nero's localized attack in Rome.
So the reality wasn't some constant 10-chapter horror story. It was more like a series of terrible, sporadic crises that were separated by huge periods of relative peace. I mean, just look at these gaps. 93 years here, 69 years there, another 43 years here. We are talking about multiple generations of Christians living their entire lives between these major persecutions. Which brings us to the final and most important question. If history doesn't really support this neat story of 10 persecutions, then why was this fable created in the first place? What was the point?
Well, the answer seems to lie more in theology than in history. Later, in the 4th century, after Christianity had become the state religion, church writers looked back and wanted to craft a narrative. They wanted to show that all that suffering had a divine meaning. The number 10 wasn't random, it was deeply symbolic. It created this powerful parallel to the 10 plagues of Egypt, and it also lined up nicely with prophecies from the book of Revelation. It gave their history a purpose.
So, what's the big takeaway from all this? The point is definitely not to deny that early Christians suffered. They absolutely did, and often in horrific ways. But that popular story of the 10 persecutions is a historical oversimplification. It's a powerful myth that was created for theological reasons. The actual reality was far more sporadic, way more complex, and frankly, a lot more interesting.
And that leaves us with one last thought. History is never just a list of facts. It's the story that we choose to tell about the past. And it really makes you wonder, doesn't it? How many other histories that we take for granted as solid truth are actually just carefully constructed stories designed to serve a purpose? It's something to think about. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer.